I want to start by saying that I have been doing this job for 19 cycles. That is not a short time. 19 cycles of standing in front of rooms full of recruits from a dozen different species and telling them what the simulation is going to feel like before they step inside. 19 cycles of watching their faces go through the stages: skepticism, curiosity, nerves, the particular kind of quiet dread that settles in right before the countdown. I have seen Drevathi soldiers cry in the hallway before a level 3 drill. I have seen Murath veterans, decorated ones, request a medical hold on the second morning of an intermediate course. I say this not to seem cold. I say it because I need you to understand that nothing in my 19 cycles prepared me for what happened on the morning of cycle 1147.33 in Simulation Wing 7. It started the way they all start, quietly. The recruits filed in at the 6th bell, which is early. We prefer early because it catches them before they've had time to psychologically fortify, before they've done their breathing exercises or their unit bonding rituals, or whatever private mental ceremony each species performs when it's trying to convince itself it's ready. The corridor that leads to Wing 7 is long and deliberately unpleasant. The lighting is kept dim. The walls are a shade of gray-green that our psychological design team identified as non-soothing across 11 of 14 tested species. The floor has a slight texture to it, almost imperceptible, but your body picks it up after a few steps, a kind of low vibration, not mechanical, just the resonance of the ventilation system tuned a few hertz lower than comfortable. We do this on purpose. Every piece of that walk is designed. The Drevathi recruits walked in first. They always cluster together, all 4 of them moving in the side-by-side formation that's instinctive for their species. They're striking to look at, Drevathi. Tall, with that blue-gray bioluminescent shimmer along the ridge of their necks that brightens when they're alert. They were alert that morning. Their neck ridges were practically glowing. Behind them came the Murath, just 2 of them in this cohort, a male-gendered and a female-gendered pair, both from the northern province of their home system based on the darker pigmentation of their secondary skin layer. The Murath walk slowly by nature, with this rolling, deliberate gait that always makes them look more relaxed than they are. I've learned not to be fooled by it. I've seen Murath recruits collapse from stress while still managing to look like they were strolling. Then the Selvari, 6 of them, which is an unusually large group from one species. They look like they're built for speed. The Selvari, all long limbs and big nervous eyes and this habit of checking angles, scanning corners. Every room they enter, they do a perimeter sweep with their eyes before they'll settle. 6 of them doing it simultaneously in the Wing 7 briefing room looks like a strange, synchronized dance. And then, near the back, came the human. His name was Dax Mercer. I had his file. I had everybody's file. Dax Mercer, 26 years old by Earth reckoning. 5 feet 11 inches Earth measurement. Weight, 183 pounds. Origin planet, Earth. A Class 7 Deathworld, 2nd tier on the galactic habitability scale, which sounds almost average until you actually read what Class 7 means. Class 7 means a planet with active geological instability, extreme weather variance, abundant megafauna in the apex predator category, and most significantly, a native species that evolved in direct competition with said megafauna without any biological advantage in size, speed, natural armor, or venom capability. In other words, Class 7 means a planet that should not have produced civilization. The math doesn't work, the variables are too hostile, and yet. I'd read the file 3 times. Dax Mercer's training background included something called Wilderness Survival Certification, which I looked up and found means he had voluntarily spent extended periods alone in Earth's uncontrolled wilderness zones with minimal equipment. He had also participated in something called free diving, which is a human practice of descending into deep water with no breathing apparatus, just whatever air they managed to trap in their lungs beforehand. He had a record of 2 years in Earth's military ground forces before applying for Galactic Integration Corps service. I noted all of this. I filed it in the part of my brain labeled interesting and moved on to planning the day's simulation parameters. That was my first mistake. He was the last one through the door. He didn't rush, but he wasn't late. He cleared the threshold with about 4 seconds to spare before the briefing clock activated. He found a seat in the 3rd row, which was unusual. Every other recruit, regardless of species, had moved to the edges of the room. It's instinctive, new space, find the wall, have the room in front of you. Dax sat in the 3rd row, roughly centered, with an empty seat on either side. He had a small bag. He put it under his seat. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked like he was waiting for a lecture on municipal water treatment. I remember looking at him from my position at the front of the room and feeling, and I will be honest here because this is a record, a very faint, unexamined irritation. Not at him specifically, more at his posture, at the sheer absence of visible tension in his shoulders. Every other recruit in that room was carrying the mourning in their body. The Dravathi were rigid. The Selvari were vibrating slightly. That fine muscle micro-movement that means their nervous systems are running hot. The Murath were doing that slow, deliberate breathing they use as a calming technique. Dax Mercer looked like he'd sat down to watch something mildly interesting on a screen. I activated the briefing. Chapter 2, The Briefing. The standard pre-simulation briefing for Level 6 Advanced Combat Doctrine runs approximately 40 minutes. The first 10 minutes are administrative, kit assignments, emergency extraction protocols, the liability acknowledgement forms that every species must sign or thumbprint or bioluminescent pulse, depending on their native signing method. Dax signed with a pen. An actual pen, the old Earth instrument. He'd brought it himself, apparently, because he produced it from his bag without looking when the forms came around. I noticed that too. The second 10 minutes are the simulation overview. This is the part I've refined over cycles until it runs like a piece of engineering, every word placed precisely, every pause calculated. I describe the environment first. Terrain Type 4, which is dense orbital jungle on a high-gravity world. Gravity at 1.4 standard, which means every movement costs more, every jump falls faster, every mistake in footing has consequences. Then the atmospheric composition, oxygen-rich, which sounds pleasant until I explain that oxygen-rich atmospheres make everything more combustible, including the vegetation, including the aerial fauna, including, in the wrong circumstances, recruits who take a directed energy hit in the wrong spot. I describe the fauna. This is the part where I usually start to see the room change. The Dravathi go rigid at the mention of the apex predators in the simulation, the Kreth-class ambush hunters, which are modeled on a real species from the outer rim but scaled up 30% for training difficulty. The Selvaris' micro-tremors increase visibly. The Murath's breathing slows further, becomes more deliberate. Dax Mercer wrote something in a small notebook he produced alongside the pen. I couldn't see what. I moved into the third 10 minutes, mission parameters. In a level 6 drill, the mission is always retrieval. You are given a target, always a piece of equipment, never a simulated person, because we found that the emotional variables of protecting a simulated person introduce too many confounding factors in multi-species groups. You retrieve the target. You extract. In a level 6 drill, the challenge is that the target is positioned in the highest predator density zone of the simulated terrain. Then I explain the casualty simulation protocol. In our system, when a recruit's biometric sensor hits the casualty threshold, which is calibrated to whatever an equivalent injury would mean for their specific biology, the simulation ejects them. It's not painful, but it is disorienting. There's a sound, a specific tone, and then the simulation drops you into the extraction hold, where you wait in a gray featureless room until the exercise ends or until your physiological markers drop back to baseline, whichever comes first. In a level 6 drill, the average casualty rate across species is 63%. I said that number out loud. I said it the way I always say it, directly, without softening, because the point of that statistic is not to terrify, it's to inform. 63% is not a failure rate. It's a learning rate. The simulation is designed to exceed what you believe you can handle so that you find the edge of what you actually can. The Dravathi recruits exchanged a look that communicated something in their visual language, a rapid series of neck-ridge pulses, blue-white, blue-white. I don't speak Dravathi visual, but whatever it meant, it wasn't celebration. The Selvari stopped their individual perimeter scanning, and all 6 of them fixed their large eyes on me simultaneously. That's a thing the Selvari do when they're alarmed. Their attention collapses from distributed to singular. It looks like suddenly being looked at by a single large creature through 6 pairs of eyes. The Murath male placed one broad hand flat on the desk in front of him and pressed it there like he was trying to anchor himself. Dax Mercer wrote something else in his notebook. I found this mildly annoying, if I'm being fully honest. Not because he was being disrespectful. He wasn't. He wasn't whispering, wasn't distracting anyone, wasn't showing off. He was just writing, taking notes. In a room full of recruits experiencing visible physiological distress responses, this one was taking notes. I wrapped up the briefing with the 4th segment, the historical record. This is where I show them the footage. 2 minutes of compiled simulation footage from previous level 6 classes. It is deliberately not easy to watch. You see recruits making mistakes, and you see in the biometric overlays exactly what those mistakes cost them. You see the casualty tone play, you see recruits drop out of the simulation, you see the moments right before extraction when a recruit realizes what's happened. I showed the footage. When it ended, I looked at the room. The Dravathi female in the front row had her eyes closed. The Selvari were still locked in that singular attention mode. The Murath female had both hands flat on her desk now. Dax Mercer had closed his notebook. He was looking at the screen, or rather at the blank space where the footage had been. His expression was, and I want to be precise here because I've thought about this a great deal, thoughtful, not distressed, not performing calm, just genuinely, quietly thoughtful, the way you look when something has given you information you're still processing. Then he opened his bag, took out a container, and started eating his lunch. Chapter 3, THE Lunch. I should explain the timing here so it makes sense. The briefing ended at approximately the 7th bell. The simulation was scheduled to begin at the 9th bell. That's a 2-hour window, intentional, giving recruits time to complete kit assignment, calibration checks on their biometric sensors, a final medical screening, and whatever personal preparation they required. Most recruits use this window for unit bonding exercises or quiet individual preparation. A few, historically, have used part of it to eat, particularly species with metabolic rates that require more frequent caloric intake. So eating during the pre-simulation window was not, by itself, unusual. What was unusual was the manner of it. The other recruits dispersed from the briefing room in various states of visible processing. The Dravathi group immediately went into a cluster formation in the far corner of the kit room, their neck ridges doing that rapid pulse communication. The Selvari split into 2 smaller groups of 3, both of which found separate corners. The Murath pair stood together near the equipment racks, speaking quietly in their language, which sounds like deep water moving over smooth stone. Dax went to the small table along the back wall of the kit room, sat down, and opened his container. I was doing rounds, moving between recruit groups, answering questions, checking in. Standard pre-simulation protocol. When I passed near the back table, I saw what he was eating. I don't know the Earth name for it exactly. It appeared to be a grain-based dish with some kind of protein and vegetables, small pieces of what might have been a legume of some kind, orange in color, mixed into the grain. He was eating it with a utensil that had 4 tines, a fork, I believe is the Earth term. He was eating at the measured pace of someone who is not in a hurry. This is the part that I have tried in the weeks since to explain to my colleagues, and the part that they always initially misunderstand. They think the unusual thing was that he was eating at all. That's not it. The unusual thing was the quality of his stillness. Every other recruit in that room was managing something. The Dravathi were actively communicating, processing together. The Selvari were in constant micro-movement. The Murath were regulating through their breathing ritual. Even the stillest of them, the Murath male, had a quality of deliberate stillness, stillness as a technique, stillness as something being maintained. Dax was just eating lunch. There was no technique to it, no management. He wasn't performing calm and he wasn't suppressing distress. He was, as far as my 19 cycles of reading recruit body language could determine, simply not distressed. Not in the way they were distressed. Not in the way that a briefing about 63% casualty rates in a high-gravity, creth-infested jungle simulation should produce distress. He finished the grain dish and started on something else from the container, a cluster of small, round fruits, dark red, that he ate one at a time while looking at the wall with the same quiet, thoughtful expression. I stopped at the edge of the table. "Mercer," I said. He looked up, "Senior instructor. You have full kit calibration in 40 minutes. "Yes, senior instructor." He ate another fruit. "I know. Is there anything from the briefing you want to clarify before we begin?" He considered this. Not in the way that recruits sometimes consider this question when they're trying to seem engaged but actually just waiting for me to leave. I know that look. I've seen it 10,000 times. He considered it genuinely, turning something over in his mind. "The Kreth-class ambush hunters," he said. "The scaled-up ones. What's their response range to low-frequency vibration? I saw in the footage one of them tracking a recruit who was moving quietly, and I wasn't sure if it was sight, scent, or vibration." I looked at him. "That is," I said, "a very specific question." "I noticed the way the recruit's boots sounded on the terrain," he said. "There was a particular kind of heel strike. I wondered if that mattered." I sat down across from him, which I don't usually do. "Vibration range is limited," I said, after a moment. "The model used for the simulation is based on an ambush species that hunts primarily by scent signature and thermal detection. Sound vibration sensitivity is secondary, below that of your species' hearing range." He nodded, processing this. "What about in heavy rain?" he asked. "Scent degrades significantly in heavy rain," I said. "Thermal too, if the atmospheric temperature drops with precipitation. And precipitation pattern in the simulation. Terrain type 4 has approximately 40% active precipitation probability at any given time during the exercise window." He nodded again, ate a fruit. "Okay," he said, "thanks." I stayed at the table a moment longer than I needed to. I'm not entirely sure why. "You're not concerned?" I asked. I didn't mean it as a challenge. I meant it as a genuine question. He looked at me, the same direct, non-performing look he'd had since he walked in. "I'm concerned the way you're supposed to be concerned," he said. "That's different from scared." I thought about that for the rest of the pre-simulation window. Chapter 4, The Kit Room. The kit calibration process takes about 20 minutes per recruit if everything runs smoothly, which it rarely does on first-time level 6 participants. The Dravathi recruits took 38 minutes for 2 of the 4. Their biometric sensors have to be calibrated to their bioluminescent physiology, and the Wing 7 system wasn't optimally tuned for Dravathi readings. My technical team spent the better part of 40 minutes adjusting the threshold parameters, while the Dravathi recruits stood with the quiet patience of people trying very hard not to show that the delay was making them more anxious. The Selvari had a different issue. Their base physiological arousal was running so high that the biometric system kept flagging them as already at casualty threshold. We had to manually recalibrate for elevated baseline, which required documentation and a verbal confirmation from each recruit that they were not, in fact, in distress, just naturally running hot. All 6 of them confirmed this. All 6 of them looked like they were lying, but that's Selvari pre-combat physiology. They can't help it. The Murath calibrated cleanly. They're experienced with galactic tech in a way that the newer species aren't, and their physiological signals read easily. Dax Mercer walked up to the calibration station, put his arm out for the sensor cuff, watched the technician run the standard sequence, and was calibrated in 11 minutes. The technician, a young Orvith named Pith, who has been on my team for 4 cycles, flagged me quietly afterward. His baseline is unusual, Pith said. How so? His resting heart rate, the Earth cardiovascular metric, is 44 beats per minute. I knew enough about human biology to know that the average range is 60 to 100. Is that a health concern? No, Pith said, looking at his readout. The documentation in his file indicates it's a training adaptation. Athletes and humans with high aerobic conditioning develop slower resting rates, but it means his stress markers are going to read differently. His body doesn't spike the same way, meaning the system might not catch his distress signals as readily. Meaning, Pith said carefully, that if he's stressed, it will look different from the other recruits. His body is trained to do something with stress before it expresses it biometrically. I looked through the window at the kit room, where Dax was fitting his simulation harness with the methodical efficiency of someone who has worn many different kinds of equipment in his life. Keep a close eye on his feed, I told Pith. Yes, instructor. Chapter 5 Entry. The entry process for a level 6 simulation is designed to be disorienting. You walk through the loading corridor in single file, spaced 10 meters apart. The lighting shifts from the standard white-yellow of the facility to a deep amber that your brain processes as threatening even if you don't consciously register why. The sounds from the simulation chamber begin leaking through the walls before you enter, not full sound, just fragments, which is worse. A rustle, a distant impact, something that might be wind or might be breathing. You pass through the entry threshold and the simulation engages, not all at once but in layers. The floor becomes terrain. The air changes. The light shifts from amber to whatever the simulation sky calls for. On cycle 1147.33, the terrain Type 4 simulation opened under what I can only describe as threatening sky. A dense, layered canopy above, and between the canopy and the ground. A green-gold half-light that the simulation team achieves through a combination of filtered photonic projection and ambient resonance. The gravity shift was immediate. 1.4 standard, clicking in the moment the threshold sealed behind the last recruit. I was monitoring from the observation station, which is a small elevated room outside the simulation field with full sensory feed from every biometric sensor and every field camera. I watched the entry sequence on 13 separate screens. The Dravathi recruits entered together. The simulation allows that, and for the first 3 seconds after the gravity shift, all 4 of them went completely still. The kind of still that means the body is doing emergency recalculation. Then the female in front took a deliberate step, testing the weight of 1.4 gravity on her frame, and the other 3 followed. The Selvari entered in their 2 subgroups. The gravity hit them harder. Selvari are lighter boned. Their home gravity is 0.8 standard, so the adjustment from 0.8 to 1.4 is nearly double. All 6 of them stumbled within the first 10 meters. Not badly, they recovered, but the stumble was there, the first small tell that their bodies were outpacing their preparation. The Murath entered last among the main group, and they handled the gravity cleanly. Murath are dense species, heavier than they look, and high gravity doesn't shock them the way it shocks others. Dax entered 3 seconds after the Murath pair. He stepped through the threshold, stopped, and stood still for exactly, I counted, 6 seconds. Then he took 1 step, then another. Then he bent down, picked up a handful of the simulated soil, rubbed it between his fingers, and let it fall. Pith, beside me at the observation station, said, "What is he doing?" "Checking the ground composition," I said. "Why?" I didn't have an immediate answer to that. I thought about it for a moment. "Texture," I said finally. "Compression rate, how deep his feet sink." "He's calibrating his movement to the terrain." "His heart rate is 51, Pith said, looking at the biometric feed. 51. Under stress, with gravity adjustment, entering an unfamiliar combat simulation environment. The Dravathi female's heart equivalent was running at approximately 210% of her baseline. The Selvari's readings were all in the acute arousal range. Even the Murath pair, who were handling it best after Dax, were significantly elevated. "He's barely touched his stress ceiling," Pith said, and his voice had a quality I'd describe as carefully neutral, the way you sound when you're not sure what to make of what you're seeing. Dax straightened, looked around at the tree line about 40 meters ahead, and started moving toward it, not running. Walking, a particular kind of walk, weight distributed, slightly toe first, the kind of movement pattern that produces significantly less sound than a normal stride. I turned to Pith. "Are you recording his movement pattern?" "Everything is recorded. Flag this segment for detailed review." "Already flagged," Pith said. We both watched the screen. Chapter 6, the first 30 minutes. The standard pattern in a level 6 simulation is as follows. In the first 30 minutes, recruits are in what we call the orientation phase. They're finding their bearings, establishing a directional sense relative to the mission target, beginning to coordinate if they're in mixed species groups. In this case, they were not operating as a single unit. The Level 6 structure puts each recruit on an individual mission path, crossing terrain simultaneously but pursuing individual objectives. In a typical Level 6 cohort, the first casualty occurs between minute 12 and minute 22. It's usually a Selvari recruit, because their movement, instinct, fast, sweeping, visual works against them in high-density ambush terrain. On cycle 1147.33, the first casualty was a Selvari recruit named Tevash, at minute 14. I saw it happen on feed 3. Tevash moving fast through a low canopy section, visual scanning ahead, not checking the vertical axis, and then the Kreth-class ambush hunter, positioned above in the upper canopy, dropped. The casualty tone played. Tevash was extracted. The readout showed he was in the holding room, physiological indicators spiking with the particular signature of extraction shock combined with the aftermath of high arousal engagement. 14 minutes, Pith said. That's actually better than the recent average. The recent average is 12, I said. A second Selvari, a female named Rethiv, went down at minute 19. Same mechanism, different section of terrain. The Kreth-class hunters in terrain type 4 are placed in a pattern that the simulation team spent considerable time designing. The pattern exploits the natural movement tendencies of each species. For Selvari, they exploit the instinct to scan horizontally while moving fast. Minute 24, a third Selvari. Minute 27, the first Dravathi casualty. At minute 30, I had 6 recruits still in the simulation. The remaining Dravathi recruits 3 of 4, the Murath pair and Dax. Dax was at this point. I checked his location marker, approximately 110 meters deeper into the terrain than any other active recruit. Pith noticed the same thing. He's moving fast. He's moving efficiently, I said. There's a difference. Fast means rapid rate of travel. Efficient means maximum ground covered per unit of risk. They look similar on a map and completely different in the field. He wasn't sprinting. He wasn't even moving quickly by the standards of a fast human stride. He was moving through terrain the way, and I looked up this description later in Earth natural history records, the way certain Earth apex predators move through dense cover. Low footprint, high awareness, constant environment treating. At minute 32, his biometric feed showed a 2-second spike, heart rate jumping to 93, then returning to 58 within 3 seconds. "What was that?" Pith said. I rewound the camera feed. At exactly the moment of the spike, Dax had stopped moving. He'd gone completely still behind a wide-diameter root structure, pressing himself flat against it. 3 seconds later, a Kreth-class hunter moved through the simulated undergrowth approximately 8 meters to his left. It passed without detecting him. After it passed, Dax waited another 6 seconds, completely motionless. Then he started moving again. His heart rate went up when he detected it, Pith said, reading the biometric graph, and came back down before he moved. He waited until he'd processed the information before he acted on it, I said. We both looked at each other briefly. "Is that usual for humans?" Pith asked. "I don't know," I said. Chapter 7, What Happened in the Middle. At minute 41, the Dravathi female, the one who had been at the front of their group during briefing, whose neck ridges had been almost constantly illuminated since the simulation began, encountered a Kreth-class hunter at close range. What happened next was, by every standard training metric, exactly the wrong choice. She engaged. The Kreth-class ambush hunter has a combat model built around 3 variables: speed, reach, and the paralytic reflex, a physiological response in prey species that produces a brief freeze when the hunter makes initial contact. The simulation team spent 16 months modeling this correctly. The paralytic reflex is not cowardice, it's biology. It hits most species within 0.3 seconds of threat proximity, and it lasts just long enough for the simulated hunter to close. She froze for 0.3 seconds. In that window, she did the thing that came next naturally: she struck. Her species' combat reflex is a forward motion, head first. It works on the same physics as a horned earth ungulate, and against most threats in the Dravathi homeworld predator catalog, it would be devastating. Against a Kreth-class hunter positioned above and forward offset, it opened her neck ridges directly to the impact zone. The casualty tone played at minute 41, 20 seconds. Minute 44, a second Dravathi went down. Minute 47, the third. The Murath pair were still in. They were moving together, which is against the individual path protocol of level 6. Technically, they should each be on separate mission vectors, but the system doesn't actively prevent cooperation, only fails to require it. I noted it. The Murath pair were cooperating, moving as a 2-person unit, and for a while it was working. At minute 51, the Murath female hit the casualty threshold, not from a hunter, from terrain. She stepped onto a section of ground that the simulation team modeled on a real outer rim jungle feature, a false surface, dry leaf and woven root over a hollow, and it doesn't hold. Her gravity-adjusted weight broke through. The fall put her at casualty threshold on the impact. Minute 51. The Murath male continued alone. Dax had reached, at this point, within 20 meters of the target marker. I was watching his feed with a degree of attention that I will admit was no longer purely professional. It had become something more like fascination, and I don't use that word easily. He had not been detected once. Not once, in 51 minutes of a simulation designed around a 63% casualty rate, had any of the Kreth-class hunters identified him. And it wasn't luck. I could see it in the footage. Twice he'd been within range of a hunter's thermal detection and had managed to place a cooling element, a section of waterlogged vegetation, a patch of ground shadow between himself and the heat sensor. Once he'd been directly downwind of a hunter's scent radius and had moved in a wide arc around it, adding 4 minutes to his travel time. He knew things about the simulation he shouldn't have known, and then I realized he didn't know them about the simulation. He knew them about terrain. He knew them about ambush predators. He knew them the way you know things when you've spent time in actual wilderness, actual predator territory, actual environments where the margin is not educational and the cost of a mistake is not extraction to a gray room. He knew them from Earth. Pith said quietly at minute 53, "He's going to reach it." "Yes," I said. "The others." "I know." The Murath male went down at minute 56. A Kreth-class hunter, East Quadrant, the pattern track that exploits the Murath movement tendency to favor the right-side approach. Dax Mercer reached the target at minute 58. He retrieved it, turned back toward the extraction zone, moved. Chapter 8: The Extraction. The extraction run in a level 6 simulation is 1,800 meters, through active terrain, with a retrieved target, a weighted container in this case, 42 pounds by Earth measurement, designed to carry like a backpack on standard recruits and require two-handed carry on species with different limb configurations. In 1.4 gravity, 42 pounds becomes 59. Most recruits in level 6 who reach the target, and that's a minority, take between 14 and 22 minutes to complete the extraction run. The terrain is more actively hostile on the return, because the simulation increases Kreth-class activity in the second hour, and because recruits who have successfully retrieved the target are, by definition, in the deepest part of the field. Dax completed the extraction run in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Not sprinting, he never sprinted. He moved with the same weight-efficient, low-footprint stride he'd used for the first hour, but with a pace increase that suggested he'd calculated what was behind him and what was ahead and determined that this was the moment to spend reserves. He came out of the simulation threshold at 1 hour, 9 minutes and 42 seconds. Which was, I checked the cohort board, 22 minutes before the maximum exercise window closed. He was the only active recruit remaining. The simulation automatically began its wind-down sequence when his sensor cleared the threshold, dimming the field, standing down the hunters, allowing the remaining simulation environment to decompress. I watched it happen on the overhead feed while simultaneously watching Dax walk out of the corridor and into the kit room. He sat on the bench. He unclipped his mission harness. He put the retrieved target container on the floor beside him. Then he reached under the bench, pulled out his bag, and took out a small container of water. He drank it slowly. Pith and I came down from the observation station. Chapter 9: The Debrief. The debrief room is designed for recovery, not confrontation. Soft lighting, adjustable temperature, multiple seating configurations to accommodate different species body structures. We'd prepared 13 seats for 13 recruits. 11 of those seats were filled by recruits who had come out of the extraction hold, still carrying the biometric and psychological signature of simulation ejection. Some of them, particularly the Selvari recruits who'd gone down early, had been in the gray holding room for over an hour, which is its own kind of strain. The holding room is deliberately featureless. It gives you time to think about what went wrong. That's the point, but it's not comfortable. When Dax walked in, 12 of the other recruits were already seated. He found a seat third row again, roughly centered, and sat down. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after something difficult. Not peaceful quiet, processing quiet. The Dravathi were doing their Nekridge communication, slower and lower than usual, the luminescent pulse subdued. The Selvari, all 6 of them, were in a cluster in a way I'd never seen Selvari cluster. Usually they maintain individual space, but they were close together, shoulder to shoulder, and they were all looking at the same point, the floor in front of them. I came to the front of the room, Standard debrief opening. Welcome back, I said. You've completed or partially completed the Level 6 simulation. What you experienced in the next 10 to 12 minutes of discussion is going to be the most important part of the exercise. This is the part where I talk about the footage. In the debrief, I show each recruit their own feed, what they did, where they went, the moments before each casualty. It's detailed and it's meant to be. I showed the Selvari feeds first because they'd been down longest and because understanding what happened to them early would be relevant context for everyone else. The footage was clear. The horizontal scan instinct, the fast movement, the vertical blind spot. I watched the 6 Selvari recruits watch themselves, and I watched the specific quality of comprehension, not shame, because I work hard to keep the debrief from becoming that, but understanding, move through them. The Dravathi feeds came next. The female's engagement instinct, the head-forward strike, the way the simulation had been designed to use exactly that reflex against them. The 3 Dravathi recruits watched with their neck ridges very still and very dark, which I've learned means something like focused attention. The Murath male watched his partner's terrain failure with an expression of what looked, across the translation gap, like a quiet and personal grief. Then I pulled up Dax's feed. I showed all 69 minutes and 42 seconds of it. I don't usually show complete feeds in debrief. I show segments, key moments, decision points. But I showed all of it, because the decision I made in the observation station, standing next to Pith and watching the biometric graph hold steady, while every other recruit in the simulation exceeded their stress ceiling multiple times, was that this was educational material that the rest of the class needed to see in full. The room changed. About 10 minutes in, the Selvari started leaning forward. Their species-typical perimeter scanning slowed and stopped, all their attention on the screen. The Dravathi female's neck ridges began to pulse with that slower pattern that, I have since had translated, means something like, I am re-evaluating a significant assumption. At the moment on the feed where Dax stopped, pressed himself behind the root structure, and waited while the Kreth-class hunter passed 8 meters away, I heard a sound from the Murath male that I can only describe as a very quiet, very contained exclamation. Not speech, just sound. When the feed showed Dax reaching the target, one of the Selvari recruits, Mevsa, the smallest of the 6, said something in their language and then caught herself and said, in Galactic Standard, he knew where to be. Could you clarify? I asked. She was quiet for a moment, gathering the translation. He always knew where to be, she said. He was always exactly in the right place before the threat moved. It looked like he could see them before they appeared. He could read the terrain, I said. He was reading indications, displacement in the undergrowth, sound pattern changes, temperature current shifts at canopy level. He was reading the environment the way a species reads it when they've spent a long time being prey. The room was very quiet. But he isn't prey, the Dravathi female said. Her galactic standard was precise, slightly formal. He is the dominant species of his planet. Yes, I said. They evolved in an environment that would kill any of us in an afternoon, and they didn't survive it by being bigger or faster or stronger than what was trying to eat them. They survived it by... I stopped. I looked for the right words. By thinking, Dax said quietly from the 3rd row. It was the first time he'd spoken in the debrief. By thinking, I agreed. Part 2. Chapter 10, after the debrief. The debrief officially ended at approximately the 13th bell. By then, what should have been a 40-minute discussion of individual performance and species-specific tactical adjustments had become something else entirely. A 2-hour conversation about Earth, about human evolutionary history, about what it means to come from a world that the Galactic Habitability Index classifies as barely survivable and produce a species that calls it home. I did not plan for this. I want that on record. The question started with Mevsa, the Selvari recruit, who asked, genuinely, carefully, in the halting galactic standard of someone translating in real time from a language that doesn't have equivalent concepts, whether the way Dax moved through the simulation was something he'd been trained to do or something he already knew. Dax thought about this for a moment. Both, he said, but mostly the second one. My grandfather used to take me hunting when I was small, and then I did a lot of wilderness time as I got older. You pick things up. Hunting, Mevsa repeated. She had clearly not encountered the concept outside of the theoretical. You pursued prey. Yeah. What kind of prey? Deer mostly, elk some smaller things. And the predators you encountered? Bears mainly. Some mountain lions. You learn to read the ground, what to listen for, what to smell for. He paused. You learn to be quiet in a way that isn't about not making sound. It's about not making the wrong sound, being part of the noise of the place instead of a different kind of noise. The Drevathi female, I learned her name properly during this conversation, Drevketh, a junior officer candidate from the outer colony systems, leaned forward with her neck ridges pulsing with a curiosity pattern. I didn't know how to read. The world you come from, she said, has creatures that kill your species. Yes. And your species has survived this. For about 200,000 years, yeah. And you go out into the territory of these creatures. Voluntarily. Dax was quiet for a second, and then the corner of his mouth moved in the very small way it moved when something struck him as something like funny, but he wasn't going to make a thing of it. We call it camping, he said. I stopped the debrief officially at the 14th bell only because I had facility scheduling constraints. I could have let it continue another 4 hours. Chapter 11. What I wrote in MY report that night. I'm including this section because it's part of the record. I filed my initial post-simulation report at the 16th bell of cycle 1147.33. The report is technically separate from this testimony, but I want to summarize what I said in it, because what I said in it is part of the story. I wrote, the Level 6 simulation on cycle 1147.33 produced results significantly outside standard parameters. All 12 non-human recruits reached the casualty threshold within the first 56 minutes of the exercise. The sole human recruit, Mercer D., completed the full mission successfully within the exercise window, retrieving the target and extracting with 22 minutes to spare. His biometric profile throughout the exercise showed what can only be described as unusual stability, stress markers consistently at or below 55% of his declared maximum, with spikes of less than 3 seconds duration on 6 separate threat encounter events. No other recruit in any previous Level 6 class has maintained sub-60% stress throughout a completed mission. I wrote, this performance is not, I wish to emphasize, the result of superior physical conditioning, although Mercer's conditioning is within the upper ranges for his species. It is the result of environmental orientation that appears to be native to his developmental history and possibly characteristic of humans raised in Earth's non-controlled zones. I wrote, I recommend a comprehensive review of human-specific training integration protocols, with particular attention to what the GIC's current curriculum is providing humans compared to what it is learning from them. I wasn't sure at the time whether that last line was appropriate for an official report. I included it anyway. Chapter 12, the next morning. The second day of a Level 6 course is typically the hardest emotionally. The simulation is the simulation. It's designed to exceed your limits, and exceeding your limits is a kind of clean difficulty, sharp and immediate. The second day is different. The second day is the day when you carry what you saw in the footage, what you saw in yourself, and you have to decide what to do with it. I arrived in Wing 7's briefing room at the 6th bell, to find that the Selvari recruits had gotten there before me. All 6 of them were seated, and they were seated differently than the day before. No wall hugging, no corner clustering. They were in the 2nd and 3rd rows in a rough line, and they were watching the door. Mevsa had her notebook open. They'd been taking notes on their own, comparing observations from the previous day. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this. Then the Dravathi recruits came in, and they sat in the 1st row. Then the Murath pair, and they sat in the 4th row on the aisle seats, which gives them maximum vision of the room without requiring them to be at the perimeter. Dax came in and sat in the 3rd row again. He had his bag and his notebook and his pen. He also had the small container again. He started eating. Mevsa looked at him, this direct, unblinking Selvari gaze that would feel confrontational from a human, but is apparently neutral in their species. And then she looked back at her notebook, wrote something, and looked back up. "What are you eating?" she asked. Dax held up the container so she could see. "Rice and beans. And some tomatoes." "What is rice?" "A grain, grass seeds basically. We eat a lot of grain. It provides sufficient energy for—" Mevsa gestured at the simulation door. "It's what I had," Dax said. "Works fine." Mevsa wrote something in her notebook. I started the briefing for Day 2, which covers advanced terrain analysis and multi-threat environment navigation. The techniques, studied and systematized, for exactly the things Dax had done by instinct the previous day. Something in the room was different. The Selvari were not in their acute arousal mode. Their eyes were still doing the perimeter checks. I don't think they can stop that entirely, but the checks were slower, more considered. They looked like people who were gathering information, rather than preparing for attack. The Dravathi female, Drevketh, asked more questions during the briefing than I typically get in an entire 2-day course. Good questions. The kind that come from someone who has watched footage of themselves making a mistake and spent the night thinking about the physics of why. The Murath male asked one question. He asked it quietly at the end of the briefing segment on terrain navigation. He asked, in the human's training history, the Earth wilderness time he described, was it formal instruction or experiential? Primarily experiential, I said. His file indicates significant amounts of time in wilderness environments from a young age, plus what Earth calls hunting, active pursuit of prey species in natural terrain. The Murath male was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So the knowledge is in the body, not only the mind." "Yes," I said, "I think that's right." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. But when we went into the Day 2 simulation, lower stakes, orientation, only no Kreth-class hunters, I watched the Murath male's movement pattern on the camera feed. He was moving differently, slower, more deliberate. He was checking vertical angles. Chapter 13. The conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I want to include this because it seems important to the record. On the break between the Day 2 morning session and the afternoon technical briefing, I was in the corridor outside the kit room doing paperwork when I heard voices from the kit room. The door was partially open. I was not deliberately listening. I was standing at the workstation 2 meters away, and the conversation carried. It was Mevsa and Dax. Mevsa was asking him about Earth. Not about the training, not about the simulation, about Earth. What it actually felt like to be on the planet. What the air was like. Whether the accounts she'd read in the GIC's planetary database were accurate. Dax was quiet for a moment before answering, which I'd come to recognize as his way of taking a question seriously. The database descriptions are accurate in the same way a medical document is accurate, he said. Everything is correct, and none of it tells you what it's like. What is it like? Another pause. Loud, he said. Not just sound, everything is loud. The colors are loud. There's so much biological activity per square meter that the space doesn't have quiet in it the way you might expect quiet to look. Even standing still, even in the wilderness, there is constant movement around you. Things eating things, things growing, things dying and becoming food for other things. And you find this. Mevsa seemed to be looking for a word. Normal, Dax said. I find it normal. When I'm somewhere that doesn't have it, I notice the absence. Is it? It does not make you feel unsafe. A pause that was different from the others, softer somehow. It makes me feel oriented, Dax said. Like, when I can hear all the things that are alive and moving around me, I know where everything is. The dangerous thing is when it goes quiet. When the normal noise stops, that's when something is wrong. There was a silence. In the simulation yesterday, Mevsa said carefully, there was a moment. Before the first hunter passed near you, I watched the footage again this morning. You stopped 20 seconds before it appeared. How did you know? The birds stopped, Dax said. The simulated birds. There was a sound profile running in the background, ambient fauna, and I noticed it go quiet about 20 seconds before I registered movement. The birds went quiet because something in their environment signaled predator. I went still when the birds went still. A longer silence. We don't have birds, Mevsa said finally, and there was something in her voice that I could not precisely categorize, not envy, not quite sadness. Something more like the recognition of a very specific kind of absence. I know, Dax said. Your planet doesn't write. Selvara is mostly ocean and low canopy surface. Yes, we have ocean fauna and we have surface runners. But the vertical, the aerial fauna, we don't have that. We have never had to read silence from above. You have it now, Dax said. That's what the simulation is for. I walked away from the door at that point because I felt, with sudden clarity, that I was intruding on something that should remain private. But I thought about what he'd said for a long time afterward. You have it now. Not said in any spirit of superiority or instruction, just factual, kind in the way that useful information offered freely is always a small kindness. Chapter 14, The Afternoon. The afternoon of Day 2 is where the simulation gets technically complex. We introduce what we call the compound threat scenario, multiple threat types in the same environment, each with different detection and engagement patterns. This is where recruits who handled single threats reasonably well in the morning start to encounter the compounding problem. It's also where we introduce the cooperation variable. Individual paths converge. Recruits may encounter each other in the field, which means they have to make real-time decisions about whether to coordinate with a recruit from a different species. Someone with different instincts, different communication protocols, different physiological capabilities. In previous Level 6 courses, multi-species cooperation in the compound threat scenario has produced, at best, neutral results. Species-specific instincts conflict. The coordination overhead is high. More recruits hit the casualty threshold in the 15 minutes following their first interspecies encounter than at any other point in the simulation. I had set up the afternoon simulation with path convergence points, designed to bring Dax into contact with at least one other recruit. I don't usually say that I design convergences deliberately. For the record, I do. The AI simulation team disagrees with me about this practice. They prefer randomized encounter generation. My argument, which I've made across 19 cycles, is that a deliberately designed encounter teaches the lesson I need it to teach. A randomized encounter might or might not produce the right variables. On cycle 1147.33, I set the convergence to bring Dax into contact with Drevketh at approximately the 30-minute mark of the afternoon exercise. I watched it happen on camera. Drevketh was moving through the dense undergrowth section, east quadrant, her neck ridges running a rapid pulse that I'd come to recognize as her high-attention signal. She'd been doing better in the afternoon than the morning. She was checking vertical angles, which she hadn't done in the morning, and she'd avoided 2 threat encounters already. Dax entered the same clearing from the north side at 31 minutes. They saw each other simultaneously. There was a brief pause, 3 seconds, both of them still, the kind of pause that happens when 2 creatures with different evolutionary histories encounter each other unexpectedly in a high-threat environment, and their bodies go through the rapid calculation of friend, foe, or irrelevant. Then Dax made a very small gesture with his left hand, down-facing palm, slow lowering motion. Stay low. Drevketh understood it, not because it was a GIC standard signal, it wasn't, but because the meaning was in the physics of the gesture. She dropped lower, instinctively. Dax pointed northeast, then up. She followed his finger line. I watched her head tilt as she registered on the camera feed. I could see it, just barely, at the edge of frame. A Kreth-class hunter in the upper canopy 20 meters northeast. She went completely still. They both waited. The hunter moved northwest, away from them. When it cleared, Dax moved and Drevketh fell in 2 meters behind him without any discussion. Just like that. They moved through the next 40 meters together, Dax reading the terrain forward and Drevketh reading the perimeter, and between them they covered both the vertical and horizontal threat axes simultaneously. They reached both their individual target markers with 6 minutes to spare. Both of them extracted successfully. In the debrief, Drevketh was asked by one of her Drevathi cohort how the coordination had worked when she and the human had no common communication protocol. She was quiet for a long moment. His body was the communication, she said. Not words, not signals. His body was already moving correctly and I followed the body.